For most of human history, people believed the ocean floor was a flat, lifeless desert, a place where nothing could survive beneath a certain depth because the pressure would crush anything unlucky enough to sink there. This belief lasted well into the 19th century, held by respected scientists who had every reason to think they were right. Edward Forbes, a British naturalist, proposed what became known as the Azoic hypothesis in 1843, arguing that life became progressively sparse with depth until it vanished entirely somewhere around 300 fathoms. For decades, this idea shaped how people thought about the sea, treating the depths as essentially settled territory, a known unknown rather than a place still capable of surprising anyone. Then cables started breaking. As telegraph companies laid wires across ocean basins to connect continents, they hauled up broken cable ends encrusted with corals, worms, and other organisms that had grown on them at depths far exceeding what Forbes said should be possible. The Azoic hypothesis collapsed almost as quickly as it had been built, and with it went the comfortable assumption that humans had a good sense of what lived beneath the waves. That pattern of confident assumptions being quietly demolished by whatever turns up next has repeated itself so many times in ocean science that it might as well be the field's defining rhythm. Giant squid occupy a strange place in this story because they were, for centuries, treated as myth rather than biology. Sailors told stories of krakens dragging ships beneath the waves, and naturalists dismissed these tales as embellished folklore, the kind of thing exhausted men see when they've been at sea too long. It wasn't until carcasses started washing ashore in the 19th century, and later until specimens were formally examined by naturalists like Japetus. The deep sea is defined, loosely, as everything below 200 meters, the point past which sunlight can no longer support photosynthesis in any meaningful way. Below that line, the ocean divides into zones with increasingly hostile names. The Twilight Zone, the Midnight Zone, the Abyssal Zone, and finally the Hadal Zone, named after Hades, reserved for the trenches that plunge deeper than 6,000 meters. The Mariana Trench, the deepest known point in any ocean, reaches nearly 11,000 meters at its lowest point, a depth so extreme that if Mount Everest were dropped into it, the peak would still sit over 2 kilometers below the surface. Pressure at that depth exceeds 1,000 atmospheres, roughly. This is not simply a matter of ocean depth being large in some abstract mathematical sense. The scale involved is genuinely difficult for the human mind to process correctly. The ocean covers about 71% of Earth's surface and holds roughly 97% of the planet's water, and yet estimates consistently suggest that between 80 and 95% of the ocean remains unexplored and unmapped in any real detail. We have better topographic maps of Mars, Venus, and the far side of the Moon than we do of our own ocean floor, largely because radar and optical imaging can map planetary surfaces from orbit, while water absorbs and scatters those signals so effectively that mapping the seafloor requires sonar, submersibles, or painstaking ship-based surveys that move at a fraction of the pace satellite imaging can achieve. The Seabed 2030 project, an international collaborative effort to produce a complete high-resolution map of the ocean floor, only reached full global coverage in late 2024, and even that milestone represents a baseline map rather than the kind of detailed imagery available for terrestrial and planetary surfaces. In practical terms, this means that entire mountain ranges, canyon systems, and geological features larger than many countries could exist on the ocean floor right now, undiscovered, simply because nobody has had the equipment, funding, or reason to look at that particular patch of seabed with sufficient resolution. New species discoveries in the deep sea occur at a pace that would be considered extraordinary in almost any other branch of biology. Marine researchers routinely note that a large fraction of the animals encountered on any given deep sea expedition using submersibles or remotely operated vehicles have never been formally described or cataloged before. Recent expeditions to underexplored regions, including seamounts off the coast of Chile and hydrothermal vent systems along mid-ocean ridges, have documented dozens of apparently new species in single trips, ranging from bizarre gelatinous organisms to previously unknown fish species with adaptations that seem almost deliberately engineered for their crushing environment. Some estimates place the total number of undiscovered marine species in the millions, a number that dwarfs the total count of all species humans have ever formally cataloged across every environment on Earth combined. This is not a statement about small, obscure microorganisms alone, though plenty of undiscovered life exists at that scale too. Large, visually striking animals, creatures big enough to be immediately noticeable to any human observer, continue to be found with a regularity that suggests we are still near the beginning of this cataloging process, rather than anywhere close to its end. Consider the colossal squid, a genuine cousin of the giant squid that is, by some measures, even larger and considerably more mysterious. Colossal squid can weigh up to 500 kilograms, making them the heaviest invertebrate known to science, heavier than giant squid despite being somewhat shorter in total length due to differences in body proportions. Unlike giant squid, which have at least been filmed alive, no colossal squid has ever been observed alive and healthy in its natural habitat by human eyes. Every specimen scientists have studied has come from fishing bycatch or from the stomachs of sperm whales, meaning our entire understanding of this animal, one of the largest invertebrates on the planet, is built entirely from dead or dying fragments rather than direct observation of a living creature going about its normal existence. Sperm whales themselves offer another clue about what might be hiding in the depths, because these whales dive to depths exceeding 2,000 meters and return bearing scars from suckers that don't match any known squid species. Scientists studying these scars have concluded that some of them come from squid considerably larger than any specimen ever recovered, suggesting that even larger cephalopods than the colossal squid may exist in numbers sufficient to leave a consistent scarring pattern on the whales that hunt them, without a single verified specimen ever being caught, photographed, or washed ashore. Bioacoustic mysteries add another layer to this picture because the ocean is not silent, and hydrophone networks designed to monitor for things like submarine activity or seismic events regularly pick up sounds that nobody has been able to definitively source. The most famous of these is the bloop, a low-frequency sound detected in 1997 by equipment originally designed to monitor Soviet submarine activity, a sound so powerful it was picked up by sensors thousands of kilometers apart. For years, the bloop fueled speculation about some enormous, unknown creature, since its acoustic profile resembled biological sounds more than mechanical ones, though it was far louder than any known animal, including blue whales, should have been capable of producing. Researchers eventually attributed the bloop to ice quakes, the sound of large icebergs cracking and scraping against the seafloor near Antarctica, and this explanation is broadly accepted within the scientific community today. But the bloop was not the only unexplained sound recorded during that same monitoring period. Other sounds with names like Julia, Slowdown, Upsweep, and Whistle were recorded by the same networks, and while some have been tentatively attributed to geological or ice-related activity, others remain less definitively resolved, existing in a middle ground between confirmed explanation and lingering uncertainty. The broader point these sounds illustrate is not that sea monsters are calling to each other in the abyss, but that our instruments for listening to the ocean are good enough to detect enormous, powerful phenomena that our explanatory frameworks sometimes take years to catch up with, and that gap between detection and explanation is itself informative about how much remains poorly understood. Hydrothermal vents represent perhaps the single greatest scientific surprise the deep ocean has produced in the modern era, and they are worth dwelling on, because they fundamentally rewrote biology's understanding of what life requires to exist. Before 1977, when the submersible Alvin first documented vent ecosystems near the Galapagos Islands, the scientific consensus held that essentially all life on Earth depended, directly or indirectly, on energy from sunlight through photosynthesis. Vent ecosystems shattered this assumption entirely. Around hydrothermal vents, superheated mineral-rich water erupts from cracks in the seafloor, and entire ecosystems thrive using chemosynthesis instead of photosynthesis, with bacteria converting amino chemicals like hydrogen sulfide into usable energy, and larger organisms like tube worms, vent crabs, and eyeless shrimp building entire food webs around this chemical process, rather than sunlight. These ecosystems exist in complete darkness at crushing pressure in water that can exceed 300 degrees Celsius near the vent openings while remaining near freezing just meters away. And yet, they support some of the densest concentrations of biomass found anywhere in the deep ocean. The discovery mattered far beyond marine biology, too, because it opened up entirely new possibilities for astrobiology, suggesting that life might be able to exist on moons like Europa or Enceladus, which are believed to harbor subsurface oceans heated by tidal forces rather than sunlight, without needing anything resembling a sun at all. In other words, one of the deep sea's biggest surprises wasn't a monster. It was a complete category of life that existed by different rules than science assumed were universal, discovered less than 50 years ago, meaning people alive today, including plenty of people who are not particularly old, were already adults when humans first learned that an entire alternate foundation for biology existed on their own planet. Deep-sea gigantism is another genuine, well-documented phenomenon that makes the giant squid look less like an anomaly and more like part of a broader pattern. Many groups of deep-sea organisms grow to sizes dramatically larger than their shallow water relatives, including giant isopods that can reach 40 centimeters in length, despite looking essentially like enormous woodlice. Japanese spider crabs with leg spans exceeding 3 meters, giant tube worms reaching 2.5 meters, and colossal squid and giant squid themselves. Scientists don't have complete consensus on why deep Sea gigantism occurs, though leading theories point to factors like colder water slowing metabolism and extending lifespan, lower oxygen environments favoring larger body size in certain physiological configurations, reduced predation pressure in some deep environments, and the general scarcity of food favoring organisms that can survive longer between meals, which large body size can help support. What matters for this discussion is that gigantism in the deep sea isn't a one-off curiosity limited to squid. It's a recurring evolutionary pattern across unrelated groups of animals, which raises a reasonable question about whether other groups we associate with modest sizes at the surface might have deep sea relatives following the same pattern, quietly growing to sizes that would surprise us, simply in locations nobody has surveyed carefully enough yet to notice. Whale falls offer a different kind of insight into how much complexity exists in deep ocean ecosystems that remains hidden simply because these events are difficult to observe. When a whale dies and sinks to the ocean floor, its carcass creates a localized ecosystem that can persist for decades, moving through successive stages as different organisms colonize the remains, starting with scavengers that strip soft tissue, followed by opportunists that colonize the bones and surrounding sediment enriched by the decomposition, and finally by specialized bacteria that break down lipids within the bones themselves over a process that can last 50 years or longer. Some organisms found at whale falls, including certain species of bone-eating worms in the genus Osedax, appear to depend on this specific type of habitat and have been found almost nowhere else, meaning their entire existence depends on the somewhat random chance of a whale carcass reaching a suitable depth in a location scientists happen to survey. Given that whale falls are relatively rare events, that the ocean floor where they occur is vast, and that a whale fall might only be discovered by chance during unrelated survey work or deliberately sunk carcass experiments, it stands to reason that a substantial number of whale fall ecosystems exist right now, hosting entire small food webs of specialized organisms that no human has ever observed or ever will observe, simply due to the mathematics of how much seafloor exists relative to how much of it gets actively surveyed in any given year. Environmental DNA sampling has, in the last decade, revealed just how incomplete our species inventories really are, in a way that doesn't even require finding a physical specimen. This technique involves collecting water samples and analyzing the genetic material present in that water, which comes from skin cells, waste, mucus, and other biological material that organisms shed as they move through their environment. When researchers run environmental DNA analysis on deep ocean water samples, they routinely find genetic signatures that don't match any species in existing databases, meaning the water contains traces of organisms that are, by definition, unknown to science, without a single physical body ever having been captured, photographed, or examined. This is a profound category of discovery because it means science now has direct, replicable evidence that unknown large organisms exist in specific locations, evidence strong enough to prove existence without yet having the physical specimen needed to describe, name, or fully understand what that organism actually is. Environmental DNA sampling essentially proves the presence of ghosts in the data long before anyone manages to see the thing making them, and the sheer frequency with which unmatched genetic material shows up in deep ocean samples suggests the backlog of undiscovered large marine life is substantial. The technological limitations involved in exploring the deep sea are worth understanding in some detail because they explain why this exploration gap persists, despite obvious scientific interest in closing it. Crude submersibles capable of reaching extreme depths are extraordinarily expensive to build, operate, and maintain, requiring materials capable of withstanding pressures that would instantly crush an unprotected human body, along with life support systems, navigation equipment suited to complete darkness, and communication systems that can function despite water's tendency to block most forms of electromagnetic transmission. Remotely operated vehicles, which don't require life support and can therefore be built more cheaply and operated for longer durations, still require support. Ships, trained operators, and tethered or acoustic communication links that limit range and complicate operation in some environments. Autonomous underwater vehicles offer more flexibility, but come with their own limitations around battery life, data storage, and the difficulty of retrieving a vehicle that malfunctions at extreme depth. Every one of these approaches costs a significant amount of money per expedition, and ocean science, unlike planetary space exploration, has never enjoyed anything like the sustained public fascination or corresponding government funding that programs like NASA have received. This isn't a criticism of any particular agency or policy choice, simply an observation about where resources have historically flowed, and it helps explain why humanity has comprehensive photographic maps of Martian craters, while vast stretches of our own ocean floor remain essentially unphotographed at any meaningful resolution. Deep-sea mining has recently added urgency to the question of what exists down there, Because as mining companies and researchers survey the seafloor for valuable mineral deposits like polymetallic nodules containing cobalt, nickel, and manganese, they are conducting some of the most detailed seafloor surveys in history. And those surveys keep turning up biodiversity that nobody expected to find in these locations. The Clarion-Clipperton Zone, a vast area of the Pacific seafloor being evaluated for potential mining operations, has been the subject of biological surveys that identified thousands of species living among and on the mineral nodules themselves, the majority of which had never been described before those surveys took place. This creates a genuinely difficult situation for conservation and policy, because the very process of evaluating an area for resource extraction is often the first time that area has ever been examined closely enough to reveal what already lives there, meaning decisions about extraction sometimes have to be made using biodiversity data that is only months or years old, describing ecosystems that took millions of years to develop and that nobody previously knew existed at all. It's worth stepping back to consider why this level of undiscovered biodiversity persists in an era when humans have mapped nearly every square meter of dry land, tracked individual animals via satellite collar across entire continents, and photographed the surface of Pluto from a spacecraft that took nearly a decade to get there. Land-based exploration benefits from a fundamental advantage that ocean exploration lacks. Humans can walk on land, breathe the air, and observe their surroundings directly with unaided senses, allowing exploration to proceed incrementally through direct human presence over centuries, gradually filling in gaps as populations expanded and technology improved. The deep ocean permits none of this. No unprotected human can survive even briefly at depths beyond a few dozen meters, meaning every single observation of deep sea life requires specialized equipment. And every meter of additional depth adds engineering complexity and cost. Satellite-based exploration of other planetary bodies, meanwhile, benefits from clear sightlines through vacuum, allowing cameras and radar to capture enormous amounts of surface data relatively cheaply once a spacecraft reaches its destination. Water defeats most of these advantages, scattering light within tens of meters and blocking most radio frequencies entirely, forcing researchers back towards sonar, physical sampling, and slow, expensive submersible operations as nearly the only viable tools for detailed exploration. Given these fundamental physical constraints, it becomes less surprising that the deep ocean remains poorly mapped and more surprising that humans have made as much progress as they have. None of this is meant to suggest that some cryptid-style monster, in the sense of folklore creatures deliberately hiding from human detection, is lurking in the Mariana Trench waiting to be discovered. That framing tends to obscure a more interesting and better supported reality. What the evidence actually supports is something arguably more remarkable than any single monster. An entire biosphere of ordinary, evolutionarily unremarkable organisms operating under the normal rules of biology, existing in numbers and varieties large enough that a meaningful fraction of Earth's total living diversity remains completely uncatalogued, hidden not by any deliberate concealment, but simply by the practical difficulty of looking in that particular place. Every giant squid discovery, every unexplained hydrophone recording later attributed to ice or geology, every unmatched genetic sequence pulled from a water sample, and every unexpected ecosystem found clustered around a mineral deposit or a decomposing whale carcass, all point toward the same underlying fact. The deep ocean is not a settled frontier where humans have found the important things and are now mopping up minor details. It is closer to being an unopened frontier, one that happens to be located on our own planet, 3 or more kilometers beneath ships that cross it every day without any awareness of what moves beneath their hulls. The giant squid spent centuries as folklore before science accepted it as fact, and even after acceptance, it took another century and a half before anyone managed to film one alive. The colossal squid remains in that folklore-adjacent state right now, known to be real, known to be enormous, and yet never observed alive by a single human being. Whatever left those unexplained sucker scars on sperm whale skin occupies an even earlier stage of this same process, real enough to leave physical evidence, but not yet real enough, in the sense of direct observation, to be formally described as a species at all. Given how consistently deep sea exploration has followed this exact pattern, revealing entire categories of life, entire biological processes, and entire ecosystems that overturned previous scientific consensus, and given that we've explored less of our own ocean floor in detail than we have of the surface of Mars, the fair conclusion isn't that something bigger than a giant squid is definitely hiding down there. It's that we currently have no reliable way of knowing what isn't, because the tools required to rule it out haven't been pointed at most of the ocean yet. And history suggests that whenever those tools finally do get pointed at a new patch of seafloor, they tend to find something nobody expected.